Imagine being so dangerous that even the dictators who employ you begin to fear you might turn against them. August 19th, 2002, Baghdad. A gunshot echoes through a luxury apartment in the Algia district. When Iraqi security forces break down the door, they find Abu Nidal, the most wanted terrorist of the 1980s, dead in a pool of blood. Iraqi authorities claim suicide. His organization insists assassination. But the truth is far more complex. A decadesal-long intelligence operation that infiltrated his network, turned his closest allies, and orchestrated the downfall of a man whose reign of terror spanned 4 continents. This is the story of how Mossad hunted the merchant of death. Abu Nidal was born Sabri Khalil Albana on May 1, 1937 in the coastal city of Jaffa, then part of British Mandatory Palestine. His family was wealthy. His father a prosperous orange grove owner who had built substantial holdings in the agricultural economy that flourished in Palestine during the 1930s. The family lived comfortably, part of the Palestinian Arab upper class that dominated commerce and land ownership in the region. Young Sabri grew up in privilege, attending good schools, wearing fine clothes, and expecting to inherit his father's business empire. But 1948 shattered this comfortable world completely. The establishment of Israel and the war that followed transformed Sabri's life from privileged comfort to refugee desperation. His family fled Jaffa as fighting intensified, joining hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who abandoned their homes, some expecting to return within weeks, others understanding they were leaving forever. The Albana family eventually settled in the Ainalway refugee camp near Sidon in southern Lebanon, one of the largest and most desperate of the Palestinian refugee camps that sprang up across the region. The contrast between the life Sabri had known and the life he now lived was absolute and devastating. From spacious homes and orange groves, the family now lived in crowded tents, then later in concrete block structures that offered minimal protection from Lebanon's winters. The psychological impact of this displacement on the young Sabri cannot be overstated. He had lost not just his home but his entire world. The future he had been promised, the status his family had enjoyed, the very identity he had been raised to inhabit. This displacement created in him a rage that would define his entire life. As a teenager and young man in the refugee camps, Sabri Albana became increasingly involved in Palestinian nationalist politics. The camps were breeding grounds for militant organizations, places where young men with no prospects and burning grievances could be recruited into movements promising to restore what had been lost. Sabri joined the Ba'ath Party in the 1950s, attracted to its pan-Arab nationalist ideology and its promises to unite the Arab world and destroy Israel. The Ba'ath Party provided structure, ideology, and purpose to young Palestinians seeking meaning in displacement. In 1955, at age 18, Sabri moved to Saudi Arabia seeking work. Many Palestinians dispersed across the Arab world using education and business skills to establish themselves in oil-rich Gulf states that needed educated workers. Sabri worked various jobs in Saudi Arabia while continuing his political activities, making connections with other Palestinian activists and deepening his commitment to the nationalist cause. But Saudi Arabia was conservative and restrictive, not conducive to radical political organizing. In 1960, Sabri moved to Cairo, Egypt, then the center of Arab nationalism under President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Cairo offered what Saudi Arabia couldn't, a vibrant political atmosphere, revolutionary fervor, and opportunities to connect with the emerging Palestinian resistance movements. It was in Cairo that Sabri Albana met Yasser Arafat and joined Fatah, the Palestinian nationalist organization that Arafat was building into the dominant force within the broader Palestinian liberation movement. Fatah, founded in the late 1950s, represented a new approach to Palestinian resistance. Rather than waiting for Arab states to liberate Palestine through conventional war, FDA advocated armed struggle conducted by Palestinians themselves. The organization's ideology combined nationalism with revolutionary rhetoric, promising that sustained guerrilla warfare would eventually defeat Israel regardless of the military imbalance. For young Palestinians like Sabri, Fatah offered agency, the ability to fight rather than simply wait for deliverance. Sabri proved himself an effective organizer and militant within Fatah. He was intelligent, dedicated, and willing to undertake dangerous missions. He established himself as someone who could be trusted with important tasks, someone whose commitment to the cause was absolute. By the mid-1960s, he had become one of Fatah's senior operatives, working in various Arab countries to establish cells, recruit fighters, and plan operations against Israeli targets. But Sabr's relationship with Fatah leadership, particularly Arafat, was always complicated by his extremism and his unwillingness to accept organizational discipline. Where Arafat eventually showed willingness to consider political solutions alongside armed struggle, Sabri remained committed to absolute confrontation. Where Arafat understood the need for alliances with Arab states, despite their often cynical use of the Palestinian cause, Sabri viewed such pragmatism as betrayal. The ideological and personal tensions between them would eventually lead to a split that transformed Sabri al-Banna into Abu Nidal, father of the struggle, and created one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations of the Cold War. The era the break came in 1974 during a critical period in Palestinian politics. The Palestine Liberation Organization, the umbrella group that Fatah had dominated, was beginning to shift toward political engagement. In October 1974, the Arab League Summit in Rabat recognized the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, giving Arafat international legitimacy he had long sought. The following month, Arafat addressed the United Nations General Assembly, declaring that he came bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter gun, and asking the international community not to let the olive branch fall from his hand. For Sabri al-Banna, this political direction represented unforgivable betrayal of the revolutionary cause. He viewed any negotiation with Israel as surrender, any political recognition as acceptance of the Zionist state's legitimacy. When Arafat and the PLO leadership began moving toward accepting United Nations Resolution 242, which implied recognition of Israel within its pre-967 borders, Sabr's opposition became absolute. Fatah's leadership grew increasingly frustrated with Sabr's opposition and his efforts to organize resistance to the political direction. In November 1974, Fatah's Revolutionary Council expelled him from the organization, accusing him of insubordination and attempting to create divisions within the movement. The expulsion was more than administrative. It was accompanied by a death sentence, issued by Fatah's security apparatus, declaring Sabri al-Banna a traitor to the Palestinian cause who should be eliminated. Rather than submit or go into hiding, Sabri al-Banna embraced his new status as an outsider and founded his own organization. He adopted the name, Dear Abu Nidal, father of the struggle, taking the name from his oldest son. The organization he created, initially called Fatah Revolutionary Council, to emphasize its claim to represent true Palestinian revolution against Arafat's sellout, would become known simply as the Abu Nidal Organization, or ANO. Abu Nidal established his organization's headquarters in Baghdad, Iraq, where he found support from the Iraqi both regime. Saddam Hussein, who would seize total power in 1979, but who already controlled Iraq's security apparatus, saw utility in supporting a Palestinian terrorist organization that would conduct operations serving Iraqi interests. The relationship was transactional from the beginning. Iraq provided sanctuary, funding, and logistical support, while ANO conducted attacks that furthered Iraqi foreign policy objectives or eliminated Iraqi enemies from its Baghdad headquarters. It began establishing cells across the Middle East, Europe, and beyond. The organization's structure reflected Abu Nidal's paranoia and his understanding of intelligence tradecraft. Unlike many Palestinian organizations that operated relatively openly, ANO maintained strict compartmentalization with cells knowing little about other cells' operatives, using multiple identities and Abu Nidal himself remaining largely invisible, operating through intermediaries and rarely appearing personally. The organization's first major operation came in September 1976 when ANO operatives attacked the Samaramis Hotel in Damascus, Syria, killing 4 people. The target was a gathering of Syrian-sponsored Palestinian groups that Abu Nidal viewed as traitors to the cause. The attack announced ANO's arrival as a force willing to strike not just Israeli targets, but also Arabs it deemed insufficiently committed to destroying. Israel. Throughout the late 1970s, ANO conducted a campaign of assassination against PLO officials and diplomats whom Abu Nidal viewed as collaborators in Arafat's political betrayal. These attacks were methodical and professional, demonstrating that AO possessed sophisticated intelligence, capabilities, and operational tradecraft. PLO representatives in London, Paris, Rome, and other European capitals found themselves under threat from an organization that seemed to have unlimited resources and reach. In June 1978, AO assassinated PLO representative Ali Yassin in Kuwait, gunning him down outside his office. In July 1978, they killed PLO official Alan al-Khalak and his aide in Paris. In August 1978, they killed PLO representative Said Hamami in London. The attack sent a clear message anyone associated with Arafat's political direction was a legitimate target regardless of where they lived or how prominent they were. But ANO's operations weren't limited to internal Palestinian feuds. The organization also conducted spectacular terrorist attacks against Israeli and Western targets. Attacks that demonstrated ruthless disregard for civilian casualties and that established Abu Nidal's reputation as one of the world's most dangerous terrorists. These operations combined professional planning with willingness to massacre innocent people in pursuit of political objectives or simply to maintain ANO's reputation and secure continued state sponsorship. In April 1979, AO operatives killed a moderate Palestinian professor in Amman, Jordan. The following month, they wounded a PLO representative in Madrid. In June 1980, they seriously wounded Israel's ambassador to Britain, Shlomo Argo, in an attack that would have significant geopolitical consequences. The Argo assassination attempt conducted in London provided the pretext for Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon. Israeli leadership used the attack to justify and military operations against PLO infrastructure in Lebanon, even though Abu Nidal's organization had no presence there and was in fact at war with the PLO. Throughout the 1980s, ANO's operations escalated in scale and brutality. The organization developed a pattern of attacking airports, airlines, and other civilian targets in operations designed to maximize casualties and media impact. These attacks had characteristics that distinguished them from other Palestinian terrorism. They often seemed to lack clear political objectives. Beyond killing, they targeted civilians rather than military or diplomatic personnel, and they sometimes appeared to serve the interests of ANO's state sponsors rather than any Palestinian cause. On December 27, 1985, AO conducted simultaneous attacks on airports in Rome and Vienna, killing 19 people and wounding over 100. The operatives, armed with automatic weapons and grenades, opened fire indiscriminately in the airports. Departure areas, targeting passengers checking in for LL flights to Israel. The attacks were coldly calculated. Massacres designed to create maximum terror and casualties. The Rome attack began when 4 gunmen approached the LL ticket counter and opened fire, throwing grenades into the crowd. Police and security forces eventually killed 3 of the attackers, but the damage was done. 16 people dead, including children, and dozens wounded. The Vienna attack followed the same pattern minutes later, coordinated to occur simultaneously with Rome. 3 gunmen attacked Vienna's airport, killing 3 people and wounding dozens before Austrian police killed 1 attacker and captured the other 2. The surviving attackers provided intelligence that confirmed ANO responsibility. Though Abu Nidal's organization initially attempted to obscure its role by having a front group claim credit, the Roman Vienna attacks marked a turning point in international perception of Abu Nidal. Before these attacks, he had been known primarily within intelligence and security circles. After Rome and Vienna, he became internationally notorious. His name synonymous with terrorism at its most indiscriminate and brutal. Media coverage depicted him as uniquely dangerous. A terrorist who attacked civilians without compunction, who seemed to kill for killing's sake rather than for any recognizable political objective. In September 1986, AO conducted one of its most infamous operations, the hijacking of Panama Flight 73 in Karachi, Pakistan. For AO, operatives dressed as security guards seized control of the aircraft while it was on the ground, taking 359 passengers and crew hostage. The hijacking lasted 16 hours before Pakistani commandos stormed the plane. In the ensuing gunfire, the hijackers opened fire on passengers, killing 20 people and wounding over 100 before being killed or captured. The Karachi hijacking demonstrated ANO's continued operational capability and ruthlessness. The organization had managed to penetrate airport security, place operatives aboard an aircraft, and conduct a lengthy hostage operation that ended in mass casualties. The attack also showed Abu Nidal's willingness to attack American targets. Panama was an American airline, and many of the casualties were American citizens, marking an escalation in ANO's targeting that brought increased attention from U.S. intelligence and law enforcement. But even as ANO conducted these spectacular attacks, the organization was beginning to attract the sustained attention of intelligence services that would eventually contribute to its downfall. Israeli intelligence, particularly Mossad, had been tracking Abu Nidal since his split from Fatah in the mid-1970s. The Argo assassination attempt in 1980 and subsequent ANO attacks against Jewish targets made Abu Nidal a high priority target for Israeli operations. Mossad's approach to Abu Nidal combined several strategies that would unfold over many years. First, they worked to map ANO's structure, identifying key operatives, understanding the organization's cells across different countries, and documenting its relationships with state sponsors. This intelligence collection required patient work, recruiting sources within Palestinian communities, intercepting communications, conducting surveillance on suspected AO operatives, and analyzing the patterns of ANO's attacks to understand the organization's capabilities and methods. Second, Mossad worked to eliminate key AO operatives when opportunities arose. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, ANO members found themselves targets of Israeli operations. Some were assassinated in European capitals. Others were arrested through cooperation with Western security services. Still others simply disappeared, their fates unknown, but their absence degrading ANO's operational capacity. These operations were rarely acknowledged publicly, but within intelligence circles, it was understood that Israeli intelligence was conducting a systematic campaign against ANO. Third, and perhaps most importantly, for the eventual outcome, Mossad worked to turn ANO operatives into sources and agents. The recruitment of sources within ANO was extraordinarily difficult. Abu Nidal's paranoia meant the organization maintained brutal internal security, with suspected traitors tortured and executed without hesitation. But Mossad had decades of experience in recruiting agents within hostile organizations. And they understood that even the most secure groups had vulnerabilities, financial pressures, ideological doubts, personal grievances, or simply fear. One aspect of Mossad's campaign against Abu Nidal involved psychological operations designed to increase his paranoia and create internal dissension within ANO. Israeli intelligence would plant information, suggesting that specific ANO members were traitors, allowing Abu Nidal's own security apparatus to do the work of degrading the organization from within. They would spread rumors about ANO operations that only insiders could know, creating suspicion about who might be talking to intelligence services. And they would occasionally allow ANO operatives to escape, capture, or survive attacks, knowing that Abu Nidal would suspect them of having cut deals with intelligence services to save themselves. These psychological operations proved devastatingly effective because they exploited Abu Nidal's greatest weakness, his paranoia. By the mid-1980s, Abu Nidal had become convinced that his organization was riddled with traitors and spies. He established internal security apparatus whose primary function was hunting for suspected infiltrators within AO's ranks. The results were predictable and horrifying. U began essentially cannibalizing itself, with Abu Nidal's security forces torturing and executing operatives based on suspicions that were often created or encouraged by Israeli intelligence operations. The internal purges within ANO during the late 1980s reached staggering proportions. Estimates suggest that Abu Nidal may have ordered the execution of over 150 of his own operatives during this period, far more than were killed by Israeli or Western intelligence services. Operatives who had served ANO for years found themselves arrested by the organization's security apparatus, subjected to torture designed to extract confessions of betrayal, and then executed. The execution served multiple purposes for Abu Nidal. They eliminated potential traitors. They demonstrated his absolute control over the organization, and they created atmosphere of terror that kept remaining members from considering betrayal themselves. But the purges also had catastrophic effects on ANO's operational capabilities. Experienced operatives who had conducted successful attacks were killed based on suspicions rather than evidence. Networks in European cities were dismantled because Abu Nidal suspected they had been compromised. Recruitment became nearly impossible because potential members understood that joining ANO meant accepting the possibility of torture and execution based on the leader paranoia. The organization was essentially destroying itself from within, assisted by Israeli intelligence operations that fed Abu Nidal's worst fears. ANO's relationship with its state sponsors also became increasingly complicated. During the late 1980s, Iraq, which had provided sanctuary since the mid-1970s, was growing concerned about ANO's activities, bringing unwanted international attention. After the Rome and Vienna airport attacks, Iraq faced pressure from Western governments, angry that Baghdad was harboring the terrorists responsible. While Saddam Hussein was generally unconcerned about international opinion, he understood that association with ANO was complicating his other foreign policy objectives. In 1983, Abu Nidal moved ANO's headquarters from Baghdad to Damascus, Syria. The Syrian regime under Hafez al-Assad, like Iraq, found utility in supporting Palestinian terrorist organizations that could conduct operations serving Syrian interests. Syria provided Abu Nidal with protection, logistical support, and probably financial assistance in exchange for ANO conducting attacks against Syrian enemies and refraining from operations that would complicate Syrian foreign policy. The relationship with Syria followed patterns similar to Iraq. ANO conducted attacks that served Syrian interests, assassinations of Syrian opposition figures, operations against Jordan and the PLO, attacks on Israeli targets that maintained pressure without triggering responses Syria couldn't handle. But the relationship was never comfortable. Assad was pragmatic and calculating, willing to use terrorists, but also willing to sacrifice them if circumstances required. Abu Nidal understood this and never fully trusted his Syrian hosts. In 1987, Abu Nidal moved again, this time to Libya, establishing headquarters in Tripoli under the protection of Muammar Gaddafi. Libya in the late 1980s was internationally isolated under sanctions and military pressure from the United States, and Gaddafi welcomed ANO as an asset in his confrontation with the West. Libya provided Abu Nidal with sanctuary, training facilities, and substantial funding. In exchange, ANO conducted operations that furthered Libyan interests and maintained Gaddafi's revolutionary credentials. The Libyan period marked both ANO's greatest influence and the beginning of its terminal decline. Libya's support allowed Abu Nidal to maintain operations despite increased pressure from Western intelligence services. But the relationship with Gaddafi was transactional and cynical, with Abu Nidal understanding that Libya's support could evaporate if circumstances changed. More significantly, by the early 1990s, the international environment was shifting in ways that would undermine AO's viability. The end of the Cold War transformed the strategic landscape that had sustained organizations like AO. During the Cold War, Palestinian terrorist groups could place Soviet and Western interests against each other, could find sanctuary in states aligned with Moscow, and could operate with relative freedom in the fragmented global order. But with the Soviet Union's collapse, this strategic space contracted dramatically. States that had provided sanctuary found themselves under pressure from a Western-dominated international order that made harboring terrorists increasingly costly. Libya, facing continuing sanctions and international isolation, began re-evaluating its support for terrorist groups in the mid-1990s. Gaddafi recognized that his confrontation with the West was economically and politically unsustainable. He began making overtures toward normalization, including distancing himself from terrorist organizations and cooperating with Western intelligence services on counterterrorism. This shift meant that Abu Nidal's sanctuary in Libya was becoming precarious. In 1999, under pressure from Libya and facing internal Security concerns. Abu Nidal moved his headquarters again, this time to Cairo, Egypt. The Egyptian government, which had complicated relationships with Palestinian groups, provided temporary sanctuary, but Egypt was under American pressure to crack down on terrorist organizations, and Abu Nidal's presence was increasingly unwelcome. By this point, ANO was organizationally degraded, its operational capacity diminished, its internal security apparatus having killed many of its most experienced operatives. Mossad's campaign against Abu Nidal throughout the 1990s involved continuing the strategies that had proven effective. Intelligence collection targeted eliminations of key operatives and psychological operations that fed Abu Nidal's paranoia. But Israeli intelligence also recognized that Abu Nidal's own paranoia and the changing international environment were doing much of the work for them. ANO was imploding under the weight of internal purges, loss of state sponsorship, and inability to recruit and retain capable operatives. By the late 1990s, Abu Nidal had become isolated and increasingly desperate. His organization was a shadow of what it had been in the 1980s. Most of his experienced operatives were dead, killed by Israeli operations, Western security services, or Abu Nidal's own purges. His state sponsors were abandoning him as the costs of association outweighed benefits and his health was failing. He suffered from various ailments that limited his mobility and effectiveness. In 1998 or 1999, Abu Nidal was diagnosed with leukemia. The disease, combined with his age and years of stress, was progressively weakening him. He received medical treatment, but his condition was terminal, giving him perhaps a few years at most. This medical reality added urgency to efforts to find permanent sanctuary where he could spend his final years without fear of arrest or assassination. In late 1999 or early 2000, Abu Nidal approached Iraqi intelligence about returning to Baghdad. Iraq under Saddam Hussein had provided his original sanctuary in the 1970s and, despite the subsequent moves to Syria and Libya, Abu Nidal apparently believed Iraq might welcome him back. The approach to Iraq was delicate. Abu Nidal had left Baghdad years earlier under circumstances that suggested some friction with Iraqi intelligence, and he couldn't be certain how Saddam would respond. But Saddam Hussein decided to allow Abu Nidal's return, apparently believing that hosting the aging or terrorist carried minimal costs and might provide some benefits. By 2000, Iraq was under comprehensive international sanctions, already isolated and confrontational with the West. Taking in Abu Nidal didn't significantly worsen Iraq's international position, and Saddam may have calculated that Abu Nidal, even in decline, possessed intelligence about Western and Israeli operations that could be valuable to Iraqi security services. Abu Nidal returned to Baghdad. In 2000, moving into an apartment in the Al-Jamia district, an upscale neighborhood in western Baghdad. He lived quietly, keeping a low profile, receiving medical treatment for his leukemia, and apparently attempting to write his memoirs. His security was provided by Iraqi intelligence, which maintained surveillance on him partly for his protection, but also to monitor his activities and contacts. The final 2 years of Abu Nidal's life in Baghdad remain somewhat mysterious, with limited reliable information about his activities, his contacts, or his state of mind. What is known is that he lived largely in isolation, seeing few people beyond medical personnel and Iraqi intelligence handlers. His organization, ANO, was essentially defunct by this point, incapable of conducting significant operations and existing primarily as a historical entity rather than active threat. Israeli intelligence continued tracking Abu Nidal during his Baghdad years, maintaining surveillance on his location and activities. Despite the obvious difficulties of operating in Iraq, Mossad had long-standing networks in Iraq dating back decades. Sources within Iraqi government and security services who provided intelligence about various threats to Israeli security. These networks would have reported on Abu Nidal's return and his activities in Baghdad. The question of whether Mossad attempted to eliminate Abu Nidal during his final years in Baghdad cannot be answered definitively from public sources. Conducting an assassination operation in Baghdad would have been extraordinarily difficult and risky, requiring either penetration of Abu Nidal's security or cooperation from elements within Iraqi security services. But Mossad had conducted difficult operations before, and Abu Nidal remained on their target list regardless of his diminished threat. On the night of August 19, 2002, Abu Nidal died in his Baghdad apartment. The circumstances of his death immediately became controversial, with conflicting accounts from different sources and no definitive resolution even decades later. Iraqi authorities initially announced that Abu Nidal had committed suicide, shooting himself multiple times. This official account immediately raised skepticism. The claim of multiple gunshot wounds being self-inflicted struck many observers as implausible. Abu Nidal's organization, such as it still existed, insisted he had been assassinated, though they offered conflicting theories about who was responsible. Some remnants blamed Israeli intelligence, claiming Mossad had finally caught up with their leader. Others suggested Iraqi intelligence had killed him, either on orders from Saddam or from rogue elements within the security services. Still others speculated about American involvement, suggesting U.S. intelligence had either conducted the operation directly or facilitated it through proxies. The physical evidence from the scene was ambiguous and, given Iraqi control over the investigation, potentially unreliable. Reports indicated Abu Nidal had sustained multiple gunshot wounds, which would be unusual for suicide, but not impossible. The weapon was reportedly found near his body, suggesting self-infliction, but the positioning of wounds and other forensic details that might clarify what happened were never released publicly, leaving room for endless speculation. Several theories about Abu Nidal's death have been advanced over the years, each with some supporting of evidence, but none definitively proven. The first theory, the official Iraqi explanation, is that Abu Nidal committed suicide, possibly because he learned he was about to be arrested or handed over to Western authorities. In this version, Saddam Hussein's regime had decided that continued sanctuary for Abu Nidal was more trouble than it was worth, particularly with the United States increasing pressure on Iraq in the aftermath of September 11, 2001. Facing arrest or extradition, Abu Nidal chose to end his own life. The second theory is that Iraqi intelligence assassinated Abu Nidal on orders from Saddam Hussein. In this version, Saddam had decided to eliminate a potential embarrassment or liability, either to curry favor with Western powers or simply to prevent Abu Nidal from providing intelligence to enemies if he were captured. Iraqi intelligence would have had complete access to Abu Nidal and could have staged the scene to appear as suicide. This theory is supported by Iraq's history of eliminating individuals who became inconvenient to the regime. The third theory, popular among those familiar with Israeli intelligence operations, is that Mossad conducted or facilitated the assassination. In this version, Israeli intelligence either sent operatives into Baghdad to eliminate Abu Nidal or more likely recruited Iraqi agents who had access to him. The operation would have been complex and risky, but Mossad had conducted difficult assassinations before and had strong motivation to eliminate someone responsible for killing Israeli citizens. The staging as suicide would be consistent with Israeli preference for deniable operations that don't create obvious political complications. A fourth theory suggests American intelligence involvement, possibly in cooperation with Iraqi dissident or opposition groups. In this version, the United States, preparing for potential military action against Iraq, wanted to eliminate a terrorist whose presence in Baghdad complicated the political narrative about Iraq harboring terrorists. American intelligence would have had capabilities to conduct such an operation either directly or through proxies, and would have had motivation to remove a figure whose presence supported arguments for action against Iraq. The truth about Abu Nidal's death may never be definitively established. Iraqi government records from the period, if they exist and contain relevant information, remain classified or inaccessible. Israeli intelligence, if involved, will never acknowledge operations conducted in hostile territory. American intelligence similarly maintains secrecy about operations in Iraq during this period. The forensic evidence was controlled by Iraqi authorities who had reasons to present particular narratives, and the witnesses who might clarify what happened. Iraqi intelligence officers, medical personnel, or ANO members have remained silent or provided contradictory accounts. What can be said and with certainty is that Abu Nidal's Death in August 2002 marked the end of one of terrorism's most infamous careers. For over 25 years, from the mid-1970s until his death, he had been among the world's most wanted terrorists, responsible for attacks that killed or wounded hundreds of people across multiple continents. His organization had pioneered tactics, indiscriminate airport attacks, airline hijackings, assassinations of political figures that became templates for other terrorist groups. The impact of Abu Nidal's career on counterterrorism and intelligence operations was substantial. His organization's sophistication forced intelligence services to develop new methods for tracking and disrupting terrorist networks. His use of multiple state sponsors demonstrated how terrorist organizations could exploit geopolitical divisions to maintain operations despite international pressure. And his eventual degradation and death illustrated how sustained intelligence operations combined with changing international circumstances could ultimately neutralize even the most formidable terrorist threats. 4. Israeli intelligence. Abu Nidal represented both a serious threat that required sustained operations and a case study in how to degrade a terrorist organization over time. The combination of targeted eliminations, source recruitment, and psychological operations that fed internal paranoia proved effective in reducing ANO from a dangerous international terrorist organization to an essentially defunct group incapable of significant operations. Whether Mossad was directly involved in Abu Nidal's death or simply benefited from circumstances created by others, the outcome was the same: the elimination of someone who had killed Israelis and who would never be brought to justice through normal legal processes. For Palestinian politics, Abu Nidal's legacy was entirely negative. Unlike other Palestinian militants who could claim to have advanced Palestinian interests through their actions, Abu Nidal's career served primarily to discredit Palestinian nationalism. His indiscriminate attacks on civilians, his willingness to conduct operations serving Syrian, Iraqi, or Libyan interests rather than Palestinian ones, and his internal purges that killed more Palestinians than his operations killed Israelis all contributed to international perception of Palestinian resistance as mere terrorism rather than legitimate national liberation struggle. The broader lesson of Abu Nidal's career involves the life cycle of terrorist organizations and the vulnerabilities that even the most dangerous groups eventually develop. A no in the 1980s appeared formidable, conducting spectacular attacks, maintaining cells across multiple countries and operating with apparent impunity under state sponsorship. But the organization contained fatal weaknesses, dependence on state sponsors whose support was conditional and revocable, the paranoid leader whose internal purges degraded organizational capability and vulnerability to sustained intelligence operations that exploited these weaknesses. The story of how Mossad hunted Abu Nidal spans decades and involves operations that will likely remain classified for generations, but the outlines are clear enough. Israeli intelligence mounted a sustained campaign combining intelligence collection, targeted eliminations, source recruitment, and psychological operations. They tracked ANOS's activities across multiple countries and, through several changes of state sponsorship, they eliminated key operatives when opportunities arose. They recruited sources within the organization who provided intelligence about plans and personnel, and they conducted psychological operations that fed Abu Nidal's paranoia and contributed to the internal purges that degraded ANO more effectively than external operations alone could have. The campaign against Abu Nidal also demonstrates the importance of patience in intelligence operations. Unlike military operations that seek immediate, decisive results, intelligence work often requires years or decades of sustained effort with small incremental gains accumulating over time until strategic objectives are achieved. Mossad's campaign against ANO didn't produce immediate spectacular results, but rather slowly degraded the organization's capabilities until it became effectively neutralized. Today, Abu Nidal is remembered primarily by terrorism scholars, intelligence professionals, and those who lived through the 1980s when his organization conducted its most notorious attacks. To younger generations, he is largely forgotten, overshadowed by subsequent terrorists whose operations have dominated more recent headlines. But for those who track terrorism's evolution, Abu Nidal represents an important historical figure whose career illustrates both the dangers of state-sponsored terrorism and the methods by which sustained intelligence operations can ultimately neutralize such threats. The apartment in Baghdad where Abu Nidal died has likely been occupied by other residents in the years since. People who may or may not know about its notorious former occupant. The organization he created has essentially ceased to exist. Its remnants scattered and inactive. The state sponsors who provided sanctuary are themselves transformed. Iraq under different governance. Libya's Gaddafi dead and his regime collapsed. Syria consumed by civil war. The Cold War. Strategic environment that enabled ANO's operations has vanished completely. What remains is the historical record of a terrorist career that spanned decades, killed hundreds, and ultimately ended ambiguously in a Baghdad apartment with questions about the exact circumstances never definitively answered. Whether Abu Nidal died by his own hand, was killed by Iraqi intelligence, was assassinated by Israeli or American operatives, or fell victim to a combination of these factors, the result was the same: the end of one of terrorism's most notorious careers and the effective elimination of a threat that had preoccupied intelligence services for a generation. For Mossad and Israeli intelligence, Abu Nidal's death, however, it occurred, represented the successful conclusion of a decade-long hunt. The man who had killed Israelis, who had targeted Israeli diplomats and civilians, who had conducted operations designed to terrorize Israel and its supporters, was dead. The organization he created was defunct, and the threat he represented had been neutralized, not through military action or legal prosecution, but through sustained intelligence operations that exemplify how modern states conduct shadow wars against enemies they cannot confront through conventional means. Which element of Abu Nidal's story strikes you most powerfully? The transformation from privileged youth to terrorist leader? The internal paranoia that led him to kill his own operatives, or perhaps the decade-long intelligence operation that ultimately neutralized him? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this exploration of how intelligence services conduct patient, sustained operations against terrorist threats engaged you, hit that like button. Your support allows us to continue uncovering these hidden chapters of intelligence history. The shadow wars conducted over decades, the operations that shaped counterterrorism, and the ultimate fate of those who choose violence as their